Hello, so today I'm going to be presenting the paper Belonging and Becoming in the City and the Countryside, Young People, Multiculture and the Urban-Rural Divide. My name's Tonkiss. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Sociology and Policy at Aston University, and I'm also presenting the paper on behalf of my co-author Demelza Jones, who is Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the University of Gloucestershire. So our paper aims to contribute new insights to a growing literature which problematises the binary definition of the convivial urban against the exclusionary rural. So I'll begin by saying what I mean by that. So urban diversity, as I think we all know, is considered a core characteristic of English cities in the 21st century. And indeed, urban areas in the UK are becoming increasingly diverse in a variety of different ways. And the study of this increasing diversity is dominated by what's known as the convivial turn. And the convivial turn posits that diversity is a commonplace and mundane aspect of everyday city life in the UK. And this has been studied across a wide range of settings. On the other hand, rural England has long been viewed as the monocultural foil to this super diverse city. So while the rural idyll, or the idea of sort of, picture postcard villages and winding country lanes and so forth, might be very central to the British national imaginary, this idea of the rural idyll masks the lived experiences of people in rural areas. And this is often characterised by socio-economic tension, with the decline of agricultural industries in particular and flight of young people to more urban areas, and socio-cultural exclusions as well, associated with rural areas being not traditionally associated with high levels of migration. In recent times, in the context of this demographic change, so fewer young people, more migrant labour in particular, but also just a more kind of minority ethnic population in such areas, means that actually rural belonging communities being remade in the context of that demographic change, but which is often rendered invisible. So while it may not on the surface appear that these areas are particularly diverse, often there are populations which are rendered invisible and excluded. So the way I've set that up obviously suggests that there seems to be quite a strong difference between urban and rural areas in the UK when it comes to cultural diversity. However, interestingly, these differences may not be as stark as they first appear. And here we draw on Limperopoulou's 2019 research, and we have adapted this chart from her wider research in this area to compare diverse conurbation centres with low migration rural areas. And what we actually see is significant similarities in those people surveyed in these different areas. So there is difference in terms of the extent to which people mix beyond their own ethnic group, depending on whether that's a diverse conurbation centre or a low migration rural area. However, across the three other variables, there's far greater similarity. So people in both areas have similar views about the extent to which they live in a place where people from different backgrounds get on well together. They have similar views about whether they feel ethnic differences are being respected in their local area. And there's a similar proportion of white British people in each of those areas who think that immigration should be reduced a lot. So what we're surprised to see really is considerable similarity between them. And it's these issues that we wanted to pick up on in our paper. So the kind of core question guiding our paper then is, how do young people attending social organisations with a non-formal educational remit perceive and attach meaning to cultural belonging and intercultural encounter? And we explore this specifically in one organisation in a diverse conurbation centre and in one organisation in a low migration rural area, in order to explore the extent to which there are those differences and to contribute to that literature which is problematising in more detail the urban-rural dialectic. So non-formal education in the UK, just as a little bit of a background, non-formal education, as we define it, takes place outside of formal learning environments, but within some kind of organisational framework. So in the UK, youth services are typically delivered by the public and third sectors and often involve religious organisations as well as major providers. Youth services, from a policy perspective, have become bound up with a wider citizenship agenda focused on enabling and empowering young people to become active citizens. but also in particular with targeting young people at risk. And the way this notion of at risk is understood tends to be with reference to policymakers' concern that ethnic minority populations are living as segregated communities and that integration is failing. And in particular, this has become in recent years associated with the prevent agenda, where people who work at youth services and volunteer with them have a duty to report any concerns they have about young people, particularly from Muslim backgrounds, becoming radicalised. At the same time as youth services having an involvement in all of these agendas, the youth sector has been a significant victim of austerity since 2010. And over that decade, there has been a 68% decline in funding. So they're significantly underfunded by kind of expectations around what they're going to deliver from a policy perspective. So the two settings for our research that we chose then, one was a Christian charity which works to encourage friendship between young people of different faiths, located in a major English city with high levels of diversity. A high Remain vote, which we take as a proxy for kind of non-nationalist sentiment, so Remain in the EU, a high vote, people wanted to remain in the EU, and a seat held by the left of centre Labour Party. The setting offers activities where young people, mainly from Christian and Muslim backgrounds, discuss their respective faiths. Setting 2 was a branch of an education and social organisation for young people in rural areas. It was located in an area of with a nice isolated, dispersed population surrounding a small market town hub. Conversely, had a 68% Leave vote, which we take as a proxy for nationalist sentiment, and the seat has been held by the right-wing Conservative Party since 2010. The setting offers activities and competitions focused on agricultural skills and rural traditions. Our research design, very, very briefly, is participant observation and semi-structured interviews with young people and older staff or volunteers working at each setting. We collected data between October 2018 and August 2019. We attended a wide range of meetings and events held at each setting, and we conducted 19 interviews. And we undertook thematic coding of interview transcripts and observation notes. And of course, far more detail about all of this is available in the paper that we've written based on this research. So to come to the findings then, what we found was difference across the two settings, as one may expect, but we also found significant similarity across a range of indicators. And the first one that I want to talk about is cultural belonging. So in both settings, while it was expressed in different kinds of ways, the idea of tradition and also values was really kind of central to how culture was understood by the young people. So, for example, Tani describes culture is like ethnicity and like where your background is and where your parents and grandparents are from and what traditions you take part in. And Harry, so Tani in setting 1 and Harry in setting 2, the culture, it's a straight line. There's not much divergent from it, from historical stuff. We do things as an organisation did them years ago. So we can see there in both cases, they express this idea of a tradition of the past, of retaining kind of the heritage that they have inherited from the past. And we see that in a number of different ways when it comes to cultural belonging and, with regards, for example, to dress. In the case of setting 1, so desire to, for example, wear traditional Bengali dress. And we also see it in setting 2 with regards to the kinds of activities that are undertaken in the organisation, being ones that have been passed down for many generations. So, for example, one example that we kept hitting back on was floristry, that there was no real appeal to floristry for any of the young people, but they saw it as really valuable, that this had to be retained and, that it should be continued. So we also then see this with regards to values. So coming first to setting 2, in setting 2, there was a kind of heavy emphasis on drinking alcohol, and there's a big focus on going to the pub together. And that's something that we would perhaps expect to see. In rural communities, pubs are often the hub of village life. They're where a lot of kind of interaction takes place. We would expect that. But the attitudes to alcohol were markedly different to those attitudes with regards to drugs, where it was seen as a matter of respect, of honesty, and that there's this risk of being a waster if you were to take any other kinds of drugs other than alcohol. And so being a waster is positioned in contrast to what the group kind of constructed as being a reliable member of a close-knit, family-focused rural community where elders are respected and people help each other out. And there was a really strong sense of that community spirit and those values from all of the young people that we spoke to. And then coming to setting 2, here we have a quote from Amal, who says, part of our culture is feeling like we've always been taught to take care of our parents. And that links with religion as well. Take care of your parents and the elderly and get along with your family. I feel like in our culture, it's a really big thing. So I think there again, you kind of really get this sense of the importance of family values and this notion of elders being respected and people in the community helping one another out. And we were really fascinated by this finding because we think that it contributes new insights to critical scholarship, taking on, for example, the prevent agenda, which is this idea of targeting and reporting young people who are perceived to be at risk of radicalisation, particularly from Muslim backgrounds, because it really shows that actually while policy seems to take forward the idea that people from ethnic minority backgrounds need to be educated in a British way of life and British values, that actually the values that they're expressing are incredibly similar. And so ethnic minorities are problematised unnecessarily from a policy perspective when we're looking at this and seeing these very similar values. So cultural difference then was another major thing that we talked to young people about. In setting 2, the young people really defined themselves strongly against the urban. So they had a strong sense of urban deviance and associated a wide range of ills to urban areas. So Abby, for example, here saying, we're not towny, we don't dress like town people. So they have a really strong sense of an identity which is very separate from the notions of urban deviance that are kind of contained within that. And obviously part of that is about the ethnic diversity of cities and the perceived ills of that in contrast to the rural idyll. They also expressed views about migrants very much in terms of like deservingness. So where migrants were viewed positively, it tended to be because they had an idea of those migrants as hardworking. So people talking about particularly migrants from the European Union saying, so George says, they made their money fair and square. I don't have a problem with those sorts of people coming in. So that's about kind of the idea of people coming in and working hard in a rural area and making money fair and square. And on the other hand, though, that was often posited against what was seen as like the bad migrant. So, and this would particularly be maybe the idea of like the asylum seeker. So Emma, for example, says they come over here for an easier life. So very much a kind of exclusionary view of people from coming in through asylum routes. In setting 1, experiences were very different because people themselves had experienced racism and other forms of exclusion. So, for example, Amal says, I feel like everyone should learn about each other's faith and culture and religion. I think it's important so you can stop all this Trump stuff. So a really kind of awareness there of the political realities surrounding these issues. We do again see that difference reflected with regards to Brexit or the UK leaving the EU. So Jack, for example, at setting 2 was very pro-Brexit, and he says, for me, the EU is the epitome of big government. It's a lot of bureaucracy. So he saw the EU as this kind of huge institution, and he wanted the UK, to be able to, in the words of some of the politicians here, take back control from that institution. But for Alia, the experience is extremely different. She's in setting 1, and she says, Brexit definitely will affect me because I am the other. I am the people that come to England to take stuff to get their jobs. It's quite scary. So she has a very strong awareness there of being made to feel like the other. And so while the nationalist rhetoric associated with Brexit isn't problematic for the feelings of belonging, cultural belonging of people in setting 2, in setting 1, it is far more problematic, and young people feel very excluded as a result. So there are clear differences there with regards to experiences of cultural difference between the 2 settings. However, we did then find some similarities when we started thinking about cultural encounter. So we know from Limpopoulu's research that there are differences between amounts of cultural encounter. And as we would expect, people in diverse conurbation centres are much more likely to experience an intercultural encounter. But what's interesting is to dig deeper and to think about the extent to which these encounters become meaningful, whether they're fleeting or that they occur at a deeper level and involve real friendship and real kind of bonding across difference. When we observed setting one, one thing that we really noticed was that despite the diverse groups present, actually young people tended to stay with people from the same ethnic groups as themselves, or at least the same religious groups as themselves. And we saw kind of organic moments where this was cut across. So, for example, an observation actually that I undertook, this was one that I went to, and we were doing some art projects, and the young people hadn't broken out whatsoever from the groups that they put themselves in, but we were listening to the soundtrack from The Greatest Showman. And as I say here in the observation, the young people started to talk about seeing the film or knowing the music, and some of them danced. This was the first time they'd really opened up to each other. So we did see those moments of kind of organic interaction. But the way that the group was structured around trying to encourage interfaith dialogue around particular questions and getting people to talk was far less successful. And Kate here is quoted, who was one of the people who ran the group, said there are times where we feel their answers are a little mechanical and they're just saying what they think they should say. So articulating this idea that actually they don't get to this deeper level of interaction within the group. In the case of setting two, this was obviously far more unusual to have intercultural encounter. But what we did find was that young people who had been to university were more likely to have experienced meaningful intercultural encounter. And so we found the university as a space within which young people's eyes were opened up to a way of life beyond the rural. So as Jack says, I grew up in a traditional farming family. Then I lived in the middle of the city, went to a university that's got a lot of different cultures. My childhood culture would be different to my culture at uni. Conversely, though, for people in setting one who were at university, experiences were quite different. And the university was not experienced as of a space of intercultural encounter, but again, staying in groups that reflect ethnic differences was far more common. So as Alia notes, there's people from all over, from different walks of life, but then we still manage to keep our own identical bubble. You kind of avoid unnecessary interactions, I guess. So there are very different ways of experiencing the university there. But I think overall, our views that what we found about cultural difference and cultural encounter was very much that while we observed differences between the groups, we did also find some similarities, and that this notion of the convivial urban perhaps masks the fact that encounters can often be fleeting and not as meaningful as might be needed to really encourage the kinds of intercultural encounter that young people might get from dedicated hours spent in a youth space, being able to do something as simple as listen to The Greatest Showman together. Conclusions then. So despite the apparent differences between our two settings, strong commonalities did exist in these young people's understandings and experiences. Cultural belonging for both groups was understood as comprising the continuity of tradition and family values. And while that was expressed differently, the values were essentially very similar. And this challenges the direction of youth policy, which seeks to problematise young people from ethnic minority groups as needing to be educated in British values. And then secondly, the idea that young people in diverse urban areas have more ready opportunities to meaningfully encounter cultural difference is also challenged by the findings. And that's directly a challenge to the austerity agenda centred on youth services. What we find is a need for these spaces of what Amin would call banal transgression, where young people can, from different backgrounds in urban and rural settings, can spend sustained quality time in one another's presence to bring about meaningful encounter. So thank you for listening to the presentation. There is a paper that accompanies the presentation, so please do feel free to drop me an email if you would like any further information on that. Thank you.